Good morning, everybody. I'm Dana White, and once again, it is my distinct honor to bring together three great minds today to explore the wisdom and relevance of Michael Gellert's new book, Legacy of Darkness and Light, Our Cultural Icons and Their God Complex. I'd like to read from the back of the book. What do Machiavelli, Abraham Lincoln, Martha Stewart, Putin, and Mel Gibson have in common? Well, each in their own ways, they resemble the stormy God of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh, known as the Father of the New Testament and Allah in the Quran. Whether or not we believe in existence, we're all susceptible to the Yahweh complex, a distinct God complex modeled upon his attitudes, emotional style, and behaviors. Michael is a Jungian analyst practicing in Los Angeles. He's the author of Modern Mysticism, The Way of the Small, Far from This Land, America's Identity Crisis, and The Divine Mind. Dr. Lionel Corbett is the author of The Religious Function of the Psyche, Psyche and the Sacred, The God Image, Understanding Evil, and Spirituality Beyond Religion. Also a Jungian analyst, Dr. Corbett is professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute, where he teaches, among other things, depth psychology. His 9-part video series that I co-produced in 2020 at the start of the pandemic continues to rank among the top videos on my YouTube channel. And Dr. Gard Jameson is also a featured participant in this 9-part video series with Dr. Corbett. I've enjoyed a more than 20-year personal collaboration with Gard, editing and designing many of the books he has authored. He teaches Eastern religions and philosophy at UNLV. It's really an honor to bring Michael together again with Lionel and Gard to talk about Michael's latest book, Legacy of Darkness and Light, Our Cultural Icons and Their God Complex. So let's begin our second conversation at the Crossroads. I might suggest that in light of all of that is happening today, there seems to be particular relevance to the legacy of darkness and light. Oh, Lionel, may I turn to you?
Yeah, well, given what you just said about all the conflict going on, I thought we might begin by talking about why the theistic God image has such a violent aspect to it. Why do the adherents of the Abrahamic traditions become so violent? Is that the projection of human violence onto their image of God, or is it something in the nature of divinity itself? What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the factors is that when monotheism came and the God of Western and Islamic monotheism, Yahweh, there was a big shift, because before that, there was only the wide range or pantheon of many gods all through the Middle Eastern cultures. They had many gods. And one of the gods among the many was the god of war. There were other gods like Aphrodite, who was a god of love, and Poseidon, who was a god of natural violence in the stormy waters, god of the sea. But when Yahweh came, all the polytheistic gods and goddesses were combined into one god. Now, it took a while for that to happen, but when it did, you have one god. And you can imagine how much stormier he's going to be, because all the different faces of the divine are in one being. And that made a particular dynamism on the one hand, positive dynamism. And on the other hand, it made for a fight that was going inside Yahweh himself. Yahweh was not only stormy in his behaviors toward humanity, but even within himself, you could see throughout the Hebrew Bible how frustrated he would get when the people would not obey him, to the point that he created Noah's flood to start his project of creation all over again. He was a tormented god and stormy himself. So I think the history, that's a historical explanation. The place where psychological factors like projection and so on come in is with nature herself, because nature herself is unpredictable and has always been stormy. Maybe not the way we're having it today, where it's man-made with global warming, but the other traditions in the world have storminess, including Taoism and Buddhism, and particularly Zen, which was one school of Zen was practiced by the samurai warriors. I think nature herself becomes the prototype, as well as the human condition, for the bad behaviors of the gods, and in particular Yahweh.
So you're saying that this is somehow intrinsic to the nature of divinity. It's not simply an anthropomorphic projection of human personality traits onto divinity.
Well, also we have to consider that the mysticism of the Western and Islamic traditions, plus the natural theology, if you want to call it that, of the Eastern traditions in Buddhism and Hinduism, there is the experience, what's claimed to be the experience of God in and of itself, the Godhead. Those are the non-dualist traditions, such as Vedanta, and in Buddhism, particularly Zen, is very focused on that. They seem to step beyond anthropomorphic material and provide an experience that cannot be described because it is beyond words. There you don't find the warrior god, the other parts of those religions, the way you do in those particular traditions. There's a oneness and an emptiness. And in Buddhism, they teach that you don't get one with the other because each one makes the other possible. So you see this all the time with people who are having a religious experience, whether you're reading about it in a book or you get a patient in your office who just did an ayahuasca journey, for example. There's an emptiness and a oneness that go hand in hand. And there you're talking about something that seems to not be subject to anthropomorphic imagery.
I guess I'm trying to understand the violence of the Abrahamic traditions that, they've spent the last few thousand years killing each other, arguing about whose image of God is the correct one and whose sacred text is the better one and who's chosen and who's not, who's saved and who's chosen. All this seems to me to be about human narcissistic vulnerability. You said before, God, the Hebrew Bible, God wants to be worshipped and gets angry if anybody doesn't do what he says. Those are human narcissistic vulnerabilities projected onto the Godhead, I think.
Yeah, it looks that way.
He needs constant praise and worship. Otherwise, he has rage attacks and so on.
Yeah, he's a very violent, primitive, and psychologically young God.
But this is all about human psychology. My point
it very much is.
Nothing to do with divinity itself.
Yeah, you don't get that kind of warfare between the gods or between God and humanity. You don't get that intense stuff in the Eastern religions. They rarely went to war over questions like you just raised, Lionel. Who is the true God, and is my God better than your God, and my God doesn't like my enemies, so we will enlist my God to champion our armies into warfare. You get wars and the same human darkness in Eastern traditions that you do in the Western ones, but rarely is a war fought over theological ideas.
Mm-hmm.
This seems to be a particular malady of the Western psyche.
Yeah, the story of Ashoka is particularly relevant. When Ashoka, as this really terrible, evil, horrible emperor, conquered a lot of India. And then one day when he was out on the battlefield, he saw women and children dead on the battlefield. And he converted to Buddhism. And he converted to that mystical sort of vision of the unity within the diversity of all life. And as a result, became this amazing figure in the story of India as well as Buddhism. I believe his symbol is on the flag of India.
So is violence somehow characteristic of theistic traditions? Traditions that have a creator god, like the Bible?
Creative, yeah.
Only? In other words, these other traditions which are not theistic seem to be less violent.
I've only counted maybe 3 or 4 wars in the East that happened over theological issues. And Gard, what you mentioned about Ashoka, it's interesting that Buddha, when he was doing his ministry, when he was traveling around North India with his followers and preaching on the streets and formulating Buddhist psychology, he never, when he consulted a king or a leader of a certain territory in India, he never told them, do not go to war or separate yourselves theologically from the thinking of other traditions. Buddhism, of course, was for a long while a sect of Hinduism before it became Buddhism. I think it's important what he didn't say as well as what he did say, because he knew that human nature being what it was might not be able to uphold the experience that he was advocating that he had. So it's there in the traditions. The mysticism in the East is right on the surface in the very teachings that everybody would be aware of. Whereas here it became the property of a few rare and small numbered people.
Primarily the mystical tradition, as you point out.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the second noble truth of Buddhism is really Jung's insight that individuation begins when we withdraw our projections. So the second noble truth, is our attachments, and attachments is really just another way of saying, Lionel, what I think you said, which is our narcissistic lack of vulnerability, our unwillingness to withdraw those projections.
Yeah. There's that, what you said, Gard, brings to mind that account Jung gives in his autobiography, where one morning when he was just sleeping in, he woke up to a dream that he had just had. And in the dream, he writes that a foreign ship, UFO, appeared above him and cast down a beam of light. And where it hit the earth, Jung was standing there. The way he explained it was that when he woke up, he right away realized what the dream said, that actually we are also a projection and we are a bundle of attachments. And that's the ego level we spend a lot of our lives in. But he said that he right away knew that what the dream was telling him was that he too is a projection, and that when the flying saucer closes the light and pulls it back into the UFO, then Jung would cease to exist as Jung. In other words, the everyday ego would return back into the self. That's a fabulous explanation for UFO sightings.
I'm just curious, Jung said 600 years, right, for this whole thing to resolve itself. I'm not sure we have 600 years. Do either of you have a sense of how we accelerate this withdrawal of these violent projections in a way that enables us to survive as a species and to help other species survive? I mean, is there an accelerated plan here? I mean, I'm seeing sheets of ice coming out of Antarctica and all kinds of things that are emerging that are probably not for the 4 of us on the screen, but for our children and their children, are going to be spooky scary as we move forward in time. But I'm just curious, do you see a way in which there can be a global shift in the culture?
Well, I think that's what has to happen. and is the core meaning of the archetype of the apocalypse. It's interesting what the Kabbalists said about this, because they had the apocalypse as part of their tradition, just like Christianity does. There's a certain number of humans that the Kabbalists say if we reach that number of humans and they are quote unquote enlightened, meaning they are privy to the true nature of the human psyche, then that number was something like 144,000, some magical Kabbalistic number. But if we get to that number, that those people will carry on the best of Western civilization and build the new one on the shoulders of the one we're now in, on the way to that. I think what they were trying to say was that consciousness, and in particular consciousness of the numinosum, that's genuine in religion, the numinosity, that will hopefully continue in some way or another if there's a breakdown of civilization, which in history is going to be showed. Every civilization except 3 or 4 had an apocalypse. The word apocalypse literally in Greek means the end of the era. So I don't know what more we can do. We can just continue to do what we're doing, and along with all the others who've read Jung and who practice Buddhism and Vedanta and who understand that things break down before they get recreated. As Picasso said, every act of creation is first and foremost an act of destruction. We can try to weather it and do our best to carry on teaching or carry on doing therapy or doing art, whatever we do that is an avenue for expressing the unconscious. I think Jung's vision, as Marie-Louise von Franz hinted about it, that we're going to have an apocalypse of some kind. Jung made a point to say that large pockets of the earth will not be inhabited and many people may die, but that there will be a continuity with humanity in some form or another.
Well, Jung would say that if there are enough individuals who are conscious, that would make a difference to the collective consciousness.
Yeah.
It's a kind of additive process. So we need enough conscious individuals.
Yeah. Individuation is the word.
So I'm curious. Richard Rohr, I'm sure you're both familiar with that name, has written a book called The Divine Dance, and he brings in the image of the Trinity, which is very interesting. And I showed Dana this picture, Rubloff, which, is this image of the Trinity. And theoretically, the original iconography, there was a mirror on the table, which allowed the individual to participate in the relationship of the Trinity and the recognition that the Trinity is something inside of us. And that, as Martin Buber said, in the beginning is the relation. And to understand that in the beginning, it was not the monarch or the violent dictator, but in the beginning was a relationship, which some might even say a familial relationship of equality and a disposition of unconditional love and compassion and mercy toward creation, might in some fashion be an image workable? I mean, what do both of you think about that idea and the idea of, instead of beginning with dictators and violent gods, let's maybe begin with the idea of relationships and equality and the recognition of diversity, and out of that, a quality of compassion. I don't know if you've worked with that image of the Trinity at all, Michael, but I'd be curious.
It comes up, the numbers 3 and 4 come up in the dreams of many patients who are in the midst of a profound transformation. It's about to begin often, and they don't know it themselves, but the dreams point to, and particularly with the alchemical axiom of Maria, the 3 turning into 4. Jung wrote about how the Trinity needs that fourth element to make a quaternity or a wholeness, whether the fourth element is the feminine in the imagery of Mary, or whether it's an image of darkness or evil gets integrated into conscious awareness, as with the mythology around Satan and so forth. The first Trinity actually appears with Abraham, where God comes down and manifests as three men. Back in those days, angels were seen as one with God, and were seen as taking human form, which was not unique to the Jewish and Christian traditions, but all the Mideastern traditions had that kind of imagery, including the Greeks. So the number three usually is a very good number when it comes up in a dream. And in mythology, it's always an announcement for some kind of transformation. Jung's essay on the Trinity gets into the subtle complexities of this. But even for people who don't understand it, if they're swept up with a dream or an image of the Holy Trinity, it's a good announcement that things are alive inside and are working.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Jung's phrase, spirits of the times, connotes a kind of irrelevance. And the polytheistic cultures had this sense that the world had multifarious character to it. And as we've moved forward in time, what it seems is that we've done is we've taken the multiplicity, and as you say, we've incorporated into a divinity that has all of the diverse characters inside it. But it seems to me that what we really need to understand is the context in which we find ourselves. It was always important to be in step with what the age was that you were, and whether we're talking about the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. And today, we seem to be kind of out of step with existence. The world is manifesting itself in a variety of different ways, both in human interactions, but as well as the natural interactions. And we can see the polar shifts, we can see global warming, and human beings don't seem to be responding to those kinds of archetypal conditions. On the back of your book, you talk about all of the various characters who felt that somehow or another they had power to do something, and they were going to use that power to their personal advantage. So how can we as human beings develop the kind of humility that will move the survival of the species from just individual bases to the whole species or the whole planet surviving?
It's a tall order, $1 million question, $6 million question.
It would help if we stop projecting divinity onto some external theological, metaphysical, heavenly big father in the sky, and recognize the notion of the self as the divine within the individual, and realize that the sacred texts like the Bible are mythological stories. They're not history.
Right.
And the individuation process is an individual mythological journey that's very unique. It's not dependent on external scriptures and doctrine and dogma. It's predicated just on one's own relationship to the inner divine.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to struggle with fighting with people about whose notion of divinity is correct.
Right.
Yeah.
The minute we put forth even the authenticity of our own experience to somebody who needs to withdraw, we might think needs to withdraw their projection, their projections onto God or onto others. The minute we try to make a forceful change in that, we become part of the problem, because we're back in the language of words and concepts, and back to, my God can beat up your God.
This is all religious narcissism. We're chosen or saved, and you're not chosen or saved, or whatever makes you special.
But those people who are functioning at that level, or they're a channel for that kind of consciousness, it's very hard to push them in a direction where they could wake up and, as that dream with Jung and the flying saucer, withdraw their projection. We're talking at the time now where Israel is about to go into Gaza and make a huge intervention militarily. I have a friend who was probably my first friend. He was, his parents and my parents were friends, and that's how we knew each other. We're born one day apart. We're not very close these days, but we do speak. And he sent me a text about the religious dimension as he sees it, and as the yeshiva rabbi he studies with sees it, of what this conflict is about. And when I responded to it, he came back with an email that was very much in the language of the Hebrew Bible. There are large pockets, that's why I tell the story, there are large pockets of people who mean well and who study religion, who are really still on a very ego-based discursive level. And the minute you say something to them, it becomes combative. So,
well, that's because they're using their tradition to bolster their own sense of self, to hold
yes, exactly. But until they're ready to change,
well, the
I
problem
don't know
is
what we can do to force them to.
The problem is that taking back projections involves being conscious of one's own shadow. And that's very uncomfortable, and it's not likely to happen very often.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the problem. It's the attachment, as Gard also was saying earlier, the attachment under the complex.
The attachment to one's own sense of self and one's own importance and so on.
That's right. And, reading the experiences of the saints and the mystics of all traditions, it becomes very clear very soon that they are clearly coming from a place that is beyond complexes. So the problem really is, how do you make available the possibility of everything we're talking about today that's positive? How do you push that forward to people who are caught in a religious complex of some kind or another? It's very hard, because if it were easy to do, we'd be doing it, but we're not.
Like all addictions, until you hit the bottom, right, you're not going to recognize your addiction. And, I loved when you mentioned the word humility. I think that's the first button on the shirt, really. And it connects to the root of that word, which is about the earth. And I think many of us had hoped that COVID-19 would be that sort of reckoning moment where there was a deeper humility across the face of the planet, because it was a pandemic. But it didn't turn out that way. And so one worries, as Jung had those images back in the early 60s that Marie-Louise von Franz shared, that it's going to be much more devastating before we finally discover that humility, or surrender to what Lionel calls the self within. Last night I was reading The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, and it's a beautiful novel of a journey and a pilgrimage, and the realization that it's all there within us. But it seems like it's going to take a big whack over the head, a Zen whack, for us to wake up.
Isn't humility and the self within, aren't those synonyms for context? The the contextualization of where we are, what we are doing, what's going on. And as we get clear about what we're about, it seems that that is throwing open the window and the divine comes through, because it is a connection of the inside with the outside, and as the alchemists would say, as above, so below. But when you throw something in between the outside and the inside, then we end up with all the shadow projections.
Yeah. Well, I think humility is very important, because we tend to have a rather unconscious hubris. You know, when Jung said every experience of the self is a defeat for the ego, we could reverse the clause and say that without a defeat of the ego, there will not be an experience of the self.
Mm-hmm.
When we try to defeat the ego in others, well, that becomes war. When we try to do it within ourselves, then we also see that war itself is a mythology that points to this idea. You know, there's two or three different types of jihad in Islam. One is the jihad that is going on in the outer world, political conquest of the infidels. And the other is the jihad that's internal, that we have with our own faith or with the God experience we may be struggling with. It's the inner conquest, as Buddha said, that is important. So it's very hard to get people to shift from the outer to the inner.
Well, it's because we're fragile creatures. We need to find a way to hold ourselves together, bolster our self-esteem, and make us feel important and significant. And very often religion's a useful tool for doing that. And anybody who threatens that, one becomes angry with them, because it's a threat to one's own integrity and sense of self. Humility is necessary for any form of genuine spirituality. Narcissism and humility just are antithetical. You can't be religious and narcissistic at the same time, because narcissism is all about bolstering the ego. And then you can't surrender, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah, and part of it, Dana, you mentioned the cultural context. You know, the nation state is a fairly new reality. You know, it's a 19th century fiction. And with that came the attachment or identification of our gods to that nation state. And I think of India right now, and there's a huge 130 some foot statue of Hanuman at the New Delhi train station. And at first, when I saw that, I thought that was pretty cool. But then I realized it was actually an image of Hindu nationalism, and the attachment to Hindu nationalism, and how that's created terror for many Muslims and Jains and Sikhs.
You know, in the LA Times this morning, there's a big article about Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
The same psychology, just to...
So this nation state has been, again, maybe a blessing and curse simultaneously.
Well, when you think that God is on our side, you know, that's the problem.
Well,
The more we're caught up in these traps, the more severe, unfortunately, an external crisis would be. A fair number of historians, as well as psychologists, in psychology, Edinger wrote his book on the archetype of the apocalypse, and his main argument was that the more we're caught up in external projections of the kind we're talking about today, the more drastic the measure has to be in the outer world to make that possible. If we're very stuck in an old paradigm, the destruction of that paradigm will need to be very strong to break us into something new, because we're extremely attached to our way of life. But it's quite clear that when we look, as you were talking Gard, about the 19th century invention of nationalism. Well, we could look through the last century and even right up to this moment with what's going on, that something is not working. We've had, in the last 150 years, 3 major wars that were propelled by industrial warfare, which killed thousands of people with a single cannon or a bomb. We're depleting the earth of its resources. Something is going to have to change sooner or later. So Edinger was arguing, as was Jung, that again, the more conscious we are of the change we need to have within ourselves as individuals, the inspiration for individuating, becoming a whole person. We're not going to get a culture that's oriented that way when the individuals in it are completely unconscious, and we're, as a collective, very attached to technology and progress and all these 19th, 20th century models of what human living should be like. There have been great cultures and civilizations in the past. The period of Greece during the rise of the Greco-Roman cultures, the democracy of Rome before the Roman dictators like Caesar came along. The Greek Republic was very democratic. Thomas Jefferson was very interested in the Scottish people who followed in the myth of Robin Hood, take from the rich and give to the poor. There's been a number of traditions that had this new kind of vision that is knocked on our doors a few times, and now, unless we really let it in, we're headed for a big crash. It looks like we're not getting the message and doing something, as you said, Gard. It may not be us, but our children and our children's children will have to wrestle with this.
Mhm.
Why is it we keep many countries elect very narcissistic leaders who become malignant narcissists and lead the country into conflict? It seems to be very common around the world now.
Yeah, I saw one, I won't mention the country, but was carrying a chainsaw. And here we are in the period of Halloween, the chainsaw massacre. And it's like, you're really going to vote for this person? It's incredibly anti-intuitive. I don't get it. It's beyond me. But I think, part of it was at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an era of great optimism at the beginning, where everybody thought, we're kind of at the end of history. Hegel thought that Germany had fulfilled all of its promises, and that it was going to be the ultimate illustration of a true culture. And Auguste Comte in France thought that the new sciences were now going to become the new religion. And, by 1914, 25 million soldiers were lined up ready to just slaughter each other. And the Titanic, which was the sort of symbol of technological prowess, was at the bottom of the ocean. So, secular materialism, right? We're talking about God images, but what about secular materialism? Is that a factor in our current dilemma? And is that a new God? For Auguste Comte, it was.
You can be a materialist and still behave in an ethical, decent way. I don't think we should.
But is there a spiritual dimension to the religious psyche? That's, I think, the question.
Say that again. Is there a spiritual dimension?
Is there a spiritual dimension to the psyche? Which I think we all agree absolutely there.
Yeah, Jung thought there's an intrinsic religious function, a religious impulse in the psyche.
Yeah.
But it can manifest itself as a political movement. Something like the Nazi movement was a religious movement in many ways.
Yeah.
So it's not always healthy.
Right. But it seems like during the 20th century, there was an impulse toward a more orthodox, more stringent, more contracted kind of theologies. I'm thinking of Karl Barth and West, who saw God as wholly other and distant and authoritative and critical. And we found similar images in Orthodox traditions, whether it be Islam or Christian or Judaism. But there was a movement in that direction. I don't know, Michael. I'm a big fan of the mystics. I think they taught us a lot about how true spirituality functions.
Right. Slippery part is that war is also numinous. To be able to distinguish a good numinosum that we would like and not the war-based numinosity we've been having for 200 years. Again, that's part of the big picture, and it begs the question, what more do we need to be hit on the head with after the Holocaust and those three wars I mentioned? Unfortunately, we're, it's like Einstein said, there are two things in the universe that are infinite. One is space and the other is human stupidity. Mm-hmm. We definitely need better education, starting not just in graduate school, but all the way with young kids. I think it was both Freud and Tolstoy said that, give me the first 5 years of a child's life and you can have all the rest. And I think, as I mentioned in our first meeting, it's interesting how the three great pioneers of depth psychology, Freud, Adler, and Jung, turned in the later part of their writings to education. It's very close to individuation. And then the field of education becomes close to the field of religion in an authentic way. But you look at all the young people wanting to get degrees in purely the external sciences, and an MBA is more attractive than a teacher's certificate. Which one do you imagine is the most important for individuation? We can guess. The crisis we're facing is an inner crisis about the relationship of the inner to the outer. But if we're not even in touch with the inner, we're not going to be able to do much with the outer. We're just going to carry on with this old paradigm.
Yeah.
Michael, you mentioned at the beginning the non-dual traditions, and they would say that reality is simply unfolding as it must.
Yeah.
That the ego really has no control over what's going on. It's simply manifestation happening.
Yeah.
Do you think?
I remember when I was 17 or so, the province, I'm from Montreal, and the province of Quebec was undergoing an upheaval, and the separatist movement wanted to separate Quebec from Canada. And there arose some terrorism activities, and Pierre Trudeau brought in the army and declared martial law. Well, that didn't make him popular with certain parts of the population, and he lost the next election after, I think, already 12 years of being prime minister. And he was interviewed the night of the election, right as the media announced that we have a new prime minister. He was interviewed and asked, what does he think about all this? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, well, the universe is unfolding the way it should. To hear that from a politician's mouth, really, it stays in my memory, is very unusual. And story ends with him being humble and learning what he did wrong, that the voters had negative feelings about. And he won the next election and became prime minister for another 4 years. So, there are individuals around who are carrying these opposites, even in politics.
But are you comfortable with that idea that we are simply manifestations of the divine dance? I mean,
I think that's the core. That's the core mystical experience.
yeah.
And empty oneness is not out there.
I was wondering whether it was any comfort to you.
It's more than comfort. In the Zen tradition I trained in Japan, you were regularly interviewing with the Zen teacher and, the Zen master whose school you were studying in. And he would ask you 2-3 times a day during a 7-day meditation retreat where you meditate from 4:30 in the morning till 9:30 at night. He would have you sit down in front of him on the zafu, on the Zen cushion in an interview, and he would say, "Show me empty oneness." And until you could prove it in a way that wasn't only verbal, he sent you back out on the cushion to dig deeper. One of the core qualities of this experience is that the person experiencing it realizes that everything about themselves is a passing. I like the way Bob Dylan said it. Buddhism says and Hinduism say that the Enlightenment experience is an enlightenment to how everything about ourselves is an illusion, including our bodies and our individual identities and our thoughts. And Dylan said, I don't think it's an illusion. I think it's an allusion. That's interesting because it incorporates the illusion and gives it its place while at the same time trying to transcend it.
Interesting.
When you were talking earlier about education, the thing that attracts me, among other things, to Gard as I've known him is his curiosity. And interfaith at its core is about being curious about some tradition that you may not necessarily have been raised in. I think about understanding. Understanding to me is perhaps not sustainable, and it's not as crucial to the growth of the human psyche or its relationship with the divine as curiosity. To me, curiosity is sustainable. You can continue to go across ever emerging, ever changing horizons because there's no place to get. There's just a shifting of the landscape as it reveals itself through time and space. And when we think that there's some place to get, we start building boundaries. We start incorporating time differently. And I'm thinking of the traditions that we have. If they don't allow room for the multiple interpretations of the human experience and the multiple expressions of the divine, we're really missing what the divine really is about.
Yeah. I mean, in religion, there's a clue, right?
I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking we know what the divine is about.
Yeah.
That's been the whole problem, right?
It's just listening. It's just, without having words to express it, develop the capacity to receive.
But again, the golden rule we find in every tradition, indigenous, every tradition. So my curiosity goes to, where is that coming from? Kant said, right, Lionel, that it's inside of you. It's inside of you.
Yes.
Yeah, and that reality is a win-win proposition, not a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big issue for me with theology and religions these days is that most, and probably the conservative elements even more so, see it as a zero-sum game. And so long as we come at spirituality or religion with that perspective, we're losers. We're losers.
Well, that's when it gets wrapped up in narcissistic issues, who's more important and all that kind of thing.
Going back to the back of your book, it seems to me that each of the personalities that you had, the Martha Stewarts, the Mel Gibsons, they believed their own press reviews. And what it was that they were about, they were seeking to perpetuate rather than giving themselves over to whatever the experience was. They sought to reinforce their own personal value. And it seems to me this is like theologians standing in front of congregations. They really have a projected sense of self-importance, in my view. And they may have come to it originally out of some sense of calling, but somewhere along the way they lost it. And I think that if we could give ourselves up, let ourselves serve, and find ourselves doing something that calls forth, let the divine, let the archetypes flow through us, be like water, the 8th verse of the Tao Te Ching.
At the end of Indian debates, they knew that it was over when everybody fell into silent communion, not into a rage. And maybe someday we can learn how to end a conversation with a sense of silent communion with that inner self, Lionel, that you speak of. Because I think, again, curiosity, what is it that's between the I and the thou? That's what I'm curious to know. What is
Maybe we should remember that those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know.
Yeah. Or as Chuangzi said, once you got the fish, can you get rid of the fish trap? Once you got the rabbit, can you get rid of the rabbit snare? Once you got the words, can you get rid of the words? Where's a person with whom I can have a word about this?
Very good. Yeah.
I really think this is a delightful place for us to bring a close to our second conversation. This has been a delightful way for us to spend a brief moment of time.
We need to be the change that we are looking for outside ourselves.
And look for the synchronicity, serendipity, and synergy in your life, because there is perhaps a clue.
Wonderful. Lionel, it's been great to see you again today. Gard, as always. Michael, be well.
Thank you
Dana,
very
thank
much.
you for putting this together and for being the host of the Myth Salon, which continues to be a fabulous opportunity to engage interesting ideas. Thank you.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you for arranging all this.